All right, guys, we're going to do the brocha. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu v'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. V'arev na Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu v'fiv beit Yisrael. V'niyeh anachnu v'tze'etzenu v'tze'etzeim beit Yisrael kulanu yodecha shemecha v'lomdei Toratecha lishma Baruch atah Adonai lomei Torah l'amo Yisrael.
Amen.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher b'cha banu mikol hamim v'natan lanu Torato Baruch atah Adonai notenu Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
Okay?
Just keep on talking. I'm just doing something, but my speaker's on. I can hear you. Just carry on.
Sure. Okay. So we're just going to learn the Mishnah Berurah quickly. What types of objects get a shechianu on purchase? So this is by Rabbi Daniel Brody. Clothes and things. If a person bought a house for himself or clothes or even significant kitchen items, he makes a shechianu, even if he already owns such items. They need not be the first-hand items, even if they are used. But for him, they are new. He still makes a shechianu. Okay, so this answers the question that I had about a second-hand car. Does that make sense? In other words, if it's an expensive purchase and it's new for you, then in that particular case, it counts. House. If a person bought a house for him and his family to live in, then it's considered that others are also benefiting from it. And thus one makes a hatov via meitiv, because we said if there's more than one beneficiary, you do a hatov via meitiv, if you yourself are getting benefit. So if it's only for yourself, like a bachelor, you make a shechianu. If a house burned down and got rebuilt, one makes a shechianu. Regarding renovations, one does not make shechianu unless one added a significant level or addition to it. So in other words, I think it wouldn't be suffice to just make sure that there's an extra study. You'd have to make a whole new level. Or I think what would be significant, for example, is not a study, but an essential bedroom, that if you couldn't have that extra bedroom for one of your children, you couldn't literally move in. Does that make sense? It's not a nice to it, so I have to. The thing I don't understand, to be honest, is if a house burnt down and you rebuild it and you're all getting benefit from it, why you would not make the brocha, obviously via hamativ, because more than one person's deriving benefit now that you rebuilt it. I'm not sure. So as far as Sephorim are concerned, in general, one doesn't make a shechianu on any new Sephorim. The reason is because Sephorim were bought to learn Torah with, and that is a duty, not a benefit. However, if one was specifically looking for a particular sefer or set and bought it, there's an added simcha, and some said that one may make a bracha on it. So this is in the Mishnah Berurah and Shulchan Aruch on 223. Okay. Thank you. Gavin has gone, but he can hear in the background, and Michael isn't here at the moment, as we can see. He's got to look after the kids. But 50% occupancy and the plane still takes off. Okay. So Kevin had a very good question, and I wanted him to ask it.
Okay, so I thought of this actually when I went over the page 15a and b. Actually, 2 weeks. I actually didn't do anything last night, because I know we're still doing 15. So what got me thinking is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is there was a blurring of the distinction between compensatory payment and a penalty. That's what I honestly, if I'm wrong, please correct me. And that's what I garnered from that. That's what I it seemed to be a discussion amongst the Rishonim or the Akroim. I don't know. I can't remember names. But that's what I got from that.
I think you're completely correct. You're completely correct. And I was hoping to knock back 15 in a week. You know, like some of the earlier dafs, Kevin, we were able to do 1 in a week. And the reality is either I'm losing my game, which is possible, or alternatively that it's getting much more tough, which is also possible. And I think you're correct in that it's been this backwards and forwards. I mean, even Michael was feeling frustrated because we're trying to determine, it's not philosophy to the point where you have to apply that philosophy. What are we saying? Is that every law system is based on a certain rationale or philosophy. But when people could lose money or lose their lives or land up in jail, or there's some very significant consequences, that philosophy better be based on some logical and sound principles. Otherwise, there's going to be an injustice. And what we're trying to do, this isn't just, I think Michael saw it a little bit as mental gymnastics. But I think the one point that we're all missing, I'm not just blaming Michael, is the fact it's not mental gymnastics, is that if you don't have clear definitions, how do you apply the law? And what we're going to see is in 15b, when they're courts in Babylonia, there's a difference between if it's a penalty and a compensation. So what we're going to learn, for example, is courts in Babylonia have not been ordained with biblical smicha, or smichin as it was known. I'm not talking about writing an exam and being able to know the difference between kosher, treif, and Shabbos and being a communal-based rabbi, and I'm not knocking it. I'm saying the difference is to be able to have biblical smicha to where you can judge, and you're ordained as a judge to judge halachically complex cases. And we learned in Babylonia they weren't given that smicha. They'd have to appeal it to a higher court in Eretz Israel. So what is one of the implications, very clearly, is that if it's determined as a penalty, then the courts in Babylonia would not be able to enforce it. If it was known as a compensation, they can enforce that. And that has real consequences in terms of who gets paid back and who doesn't get paid back. And having to go to Eretz Israel and how to claim back your item and your damages. So that sort of, should we say, mental rationale, unless it gets governed in terms of halacha about what is the deciding opinion. In other words, it can't stay in the air. If it doesn't choose a route, then how are you going to implement it in the court? So what we're going to determine is we're going to just get a bit of a sense of it, because when we were going through it last week, there seemed to be a little bit of getting used to the issues. So the latter part of the 15th daf deals with implementation, as well as the 16th daf, and the beginning part, and even the part first of 15b, and certainly 15a, is dealing with this particular case. I mean, we firstly dealt with what constituted a valid witness, and then were women responsible for paying damages and receiving damages. That was a different part. And we said that they can't be witnesses, which was also a chiddush as to why, because they were giving testimony to a third party. And now we're saying that we need to find out the halacha. So one thing is clear that we've learned is that anything to do with a muad ox is mammon. Now, do you know what mammon is?
Money.
Now, mammon is compensation. A knas is a penalty. A knas is a penalty, and a mammon is a compensation. So for whenever an ox is muad, it's mammon. What makes it mammon is that you pay the full amount. If the damage or death of the animal is worth 300 zuz, you pay that in full from choice property or cash. That's what makes it compensation, because you're compensating for the person's loss exactly. Does that make sense? When you're talking about a knas, a penalty, it has three distinct features. It doesn't have to have all these features, but it certainly has to have one or two of them. It doesn't even have to have two. It could have one out of the three. But a perfect example of a case where it would have three in one is if we take an example, the only example of a muad-based knas you could think of would be the 30 shekels of silver you pay if your ox kills another Jew's slave, Evet Knani, Canaanite slave. So you pay 30 shekels of silver. So how do we know it's a knas, a penalty? Okay, now you pay we know this simply because is that even if the slave is worth 1 dinar, which is a fraction of that, you still have to pay it. And we learned that anything that you pay more than what that value is worth of the damage is a knas, it's a penalty. That's your first characteristic. Your second characteristic of a penalty is if it is a fixed amount. Does that make sense? So, for example, we learn in a case of, you've got a case of a defamer and this rapist and a seducer where you're having 50 and 100 zuz payments, etc. We're not going to go through all those previous cases where it's a set amount. So the minute it's a set amount, that's another clue that it's a knas, a penalty. And your third clue, which is probably the most practical that applies all the time, is the fact by your own admission you don't pay. So you might turn around and say, well, what's the point of that? If you don't pay by your own admission, then why even have it there? And there's a particular reason. That reason is to get you to pay the compensatory amount. Okay? So, for example, if I share my screen, let me just see if I've got it here. Okay, if I share my screen here. Okay, let's just see where we are. Yeah. I want Arthur you to read this Mishnah quickly.
Okay. Mishnah. One who says, I seduced the daughter of so-and-so, pays compensation for humiliation and degradation based on his own admission, but he does not pay the fine. Similarly, one who says, I stole, pays the principal, the value of the stolen goods based on his own admission, but does not pay the double payment and the payment 4 and 5 times the principal for the slaughter or sale of a sheep or an ox that he stole. Likewise, if he's confessed, my ox killed so-and-so, or my ox killed an ox belonging to so-and-so, this owner pays based on his own admission. However, if he said, my ox killed a slave belonging to so-and-so, he does not pay based on his own admission, as that payment is a fine. This is the principle: anyone who pays more than what he damaged. The payments are fines, and therefore he does not pay based on his own admission. He pays only based on the testimony of others.
Good. So this is what we're saying, guys, in a nutshell. Is we're saying a couple of things. So if you can pay by your own admission, what's the point of the penalty? Well, it's a deterrent. So let me explain to you. If you steal 100 zuz, you don't want to very few people after they steal 100 zuz are going to come clean. So if there's a suspicion, they're going to have to come and make an oath. Now, at that point, when a person is called to court, they don't know if somebody has witnessed this. They're very nervous. They don't know if they've witnessed it. Suddenly, they have to do an oath in Hashem's name. And at that point, many people are terrified. Anybody in their right mind is terrified of using Hashem's name in vain and making an oath to Hashem that they never stole, because Hashem sees everything. So at that point, many of them will come clean because, again, they don't know if they're witnesses that are going to be amassed against them. They're suddenly just called to court. I'm saying they're called to give an oath or testimony. So most people crack under that point. And they don't want to use Hashem's name in vain. Again, they don't have their witnesses against them, and they say that they stop. Fine. So then if they stop 100 zuz, they pay back 100 zuz. But let's just say, for example, they stole an ox. Then what you do is you have to pay a 5-time payment. What is the 5 times? The first time is for the actual value of the animal. So say it's 100 zuz. And an ox is never only worth 100 zuz. Let's just say it's 200 zuz. But let's say that for the 200 zuz, they're 4 times the penalty on top of that 200 zuz. So what does that make it? That makes that an extra 8,000 zuz. Sorry, 800 zuz.
100.
So, sorry. Okay. It makes it 800 zuz.
800.
Yeah, I'm saying that. So in total, it's 1,000 zuz. Now, it's one thing to pay back the 200 zuz, because again, if you use the 200 zuz, you got that money, technically. You can sell it and get that. So you figure, listen, I haven't lost anything and I haven't gained anything. So let me pay it back. The person's happy because they get back the compensation of what you stole, and they don't have to pay another 800 zuz in terms of the penalty. Because again, if the penalty is times 5, the principal amount of 1/5 of that would be the actual compensatory amount, and the 4/5 would be the penalty. So it's getting that person to be deterred where they're coming clean and they're recuperating the lost person they stole from on the principal amount. Does that make sense? All the court wants is the person to get paid back. They're quite happy when the person admits they've done wrong. If the court isn't troubled, to say, all right, we'll let go of the penalty. Just pay the compensatory amount, the principal amount. Does this make sense, guys?
Yeah. On mark, yes.
Okay, it should make sense. So Kevin, what I'm saying to you is that we know with Muad, it's always compensation because you're paying back exactly what you took. What our question is what is the halacha with regard to a tam? Because Rav Papa is saying that tam is actually considered compensation. Why is it considered compensation? Is because as far as he's concerned, the ox is prone to damage anyway, all the time. And therefore, just because it's your first offense, you're given a leniency where you only have to pay the half back the compensation. And it says where the damager and damage is responsible for payments. So how can we say a damaged party pays? We understand how a damager pays. Is because when he's receiving half the amount he's entitled to, he's also paying in 50%. Does that make sense? So we understand it according to Rav Papa. We're a bit more confused with Rav Huna, the son of Yeshua, who says it's a penalty payment. Because he said the ox hasn't got any track record of it, and therefore when he damages, the only reason why we penalize the owner is to get him to be super careful in the future, but that the injured party isn't entitled to anything because it's a tame ox. And since the injured party isn't entitled to anything, and in fact, who could have kept the penalty? The court. Because whenever you have a penalty with the government for littering or tax or whatever, the government keeps it. In this case, they're being kind by giving the injured party that penalty, but for him it's a windfall. Because the animal was a tame animal, according to Rav Huna, the son of Yeshua, he's not entitled to anything, the injured party. So great, he scored 50%. So we're saying we don't understand in what way he contributed to the damage as the injured party, because we say both the damager and the damaged contribute. We're saying because he has to pick up the cost of the carcass depreciation, the injured party. So in that way, he's absorbing a certain amount of cost himself. So we're saying, but we already learned this in a previous, in the previous Mishnah when we were talking about a pit for a muad animal. Remember when he has to absorb the depreciation of the carcass? So the Gemara is saying, listen, we've gone through this with muad. What did we need to know this for? So we say we needed to know it for the case of a tam. Is that if you see it according to Rav Yeshua, Rav Huna ben Yeshua, you would say, but we don't know what the case is of tam. Let me give you an example of why we can't assume. We might have said that, listen, in the case of a muad, I understand because the guy's paying the full amount. So therefore, he's done what he's had to do. You know, the depreciation of the carcass is now for the injured party. But we're saying we could have come to the conclusion for the tam that the depreciation is paid by the damager because the guy's really not paying the full amount for the damage, and therefore he should pay for the depreciation as well. So we need to be taught specifically in the case of tam, Kevin, that that we can't assume that just because he's paying half damage that he should in addition pay for the depreciation of the carcass. That's why we had to learn specifically in this case of Tam, because in the pit we learned the case of Muad. And why did we have to also bring up the case of Muad again? Is because we could have said shame, it was a first time offense, and that's why it doesn't pay for depreciation of the carcass, because again, the guy wasn't his fault. This was especially if we say it's a penalty, and the Torah doesn't hold him liable, and they just give him the penalty to be more careful in the future, why would he have to pay for the depreciation of the ox? So we're saying that in that case, you would understand that a Muad person was forewarned many times, and therefore should pay for the depreciation of the ox. So we're reminding the person again that he doesn't pay for the depreciation of the ox. The guy's paid a full amount, it's fine. You pay the depreciation of the ox. So this Mishnah was coming to say, whether it's Tam or Muad, there are logical reasons to assume that the injured party doesn't pay for the depreciation of the carcass. And they had to be taught that whether it was a Tam or Muad, they have to pay for the depreciation of the carcass. Does that make sense, Kevin?
Yeah, I just want to ask one question quickly. Not to do with Tam, to do with Muad. I'm slightly confused. With the Muad ox, right, if it's worth 3,000 zuz, and you pay the 3,000 zuz, why does the damaged party get to keep the carcass, number one? And there is no depreciation. He's got the full value of the animal. So there is no depreciation. He's lucky to get whatever he's getting anyway. It's like a gift for him.
Okay, so let's just determine this. Okay, let's use the term. I love that term. What's your question? It's very good. So let's just say 300 zuz, just because it's more in line with the payments they use in the Gemara, not 3,000. But I think the question is excellent. So what Gavin is asking, let me see if I understand this correctly, is that you're saying you don't understand. You're paying the guy back exactly. So why would it be a case where in terms of the depreciation of the carcass would matter? I will tell you, Gav, you asked this the other day, but I will address it again. Okay, the reason I'm saying this is as follows. In the case of the pit, okay, you see, where you're getting confused, it's not your fault, is that we've done so many complex cases that I even got confused at this, is that we're mixing keren damage with pit damage. Okay, let me just explain to you why. So I have a pit, your ox falls into it, and now we've got an issue of retrieving the body from the pit, okay? And we've got an issue of the pit being Muad from start because it was an obstruction and it's prone to damage from inception, Kevin. Kev? Arthur, are you there? I don't know where Arthur's gone. So what I'm saying is, Gavin, this is it, right? So your ox lies dead in the pit at the bottom. Now you pull that ox out. Now what we're saying there is when you pull your ox out, although I pay the full amount of the ox, okay, I pay the difference. We learned about nezek shalom and katsi nezek, half payments and full payments. So we're saying for the full payment, we learned this, that I pay you only the balance. I don't pay you the 300 zuz. So what we learned is that your ox, say for example, alive was worth 300 zuz, and dead it's worth 220 zuz. But my pit is Muad from the start. I have to pay you the 80 zuz difference, and you get to sell your carcass, and that's where I don't pay you the full amount and I keep the carcass as the damager. You keep the carcass, I pay you the difference.
Okay, now what is like, sorry.
Since you bought the carcass, it's going to depreciate and you need to address it quickly. Yeah. But I think your question is excellent, and this proves you're awake, you know the right questions to ask, and we also need to do Chazorah. Not you, yeah. Because unless you constantly do it, but it's a brilliant question. Brilliant. I hope I explained it well.
Very well, very well. I want to clear now. Thank you.
So we've got 10 minutes just to cover a little bit of ground. All I'm saying to Kevin is that when we learn, because this was the case, what we're saying in the Gemara, quickly, here's my own notes. Yeah, you can see these are my own notes. that there was a clause that said that muad is compensation always. Why? Because you pay by your own admission, meaning you can't get out of it. When you turn around and say I did wrong, you can say yes, but you still caused the person that damage. We're not going to whack you the penalty, but you need to pay it back. You can't by your own admission come off the hook. So we're saying that there should be a subclause, and that subclause is that we should say then tam is a penalty payment, or we should say then tam is also a compensation. Exactly as Kevin is saying, we don't know what's going on here. So we're trying to find out, is it the tam, the half payment, is it according to Rav Papa compensation, or Rav Huna ben Yeshua that it's a penalty? Because if we say that it's a penalty, it should say, the main Mishnah should say, muad is a compensation, the subclause is it should be a penalty. And then we say maybe the Mishnah and the Brisa left out something, because there's a concept called Tana Bashir, which means if it's only one thing you left out, you have to state it. And if it's more than one thing, it's got to be two or more, then that's noted as an omission. Does that make sense? So it's like you've got a pantry and a kitchen. If you write down only 4 items and your pantry's got 200 items, by writing down 4 items, you can assume that there's more in the pantry that you left out. It's just that these are the issues you're dealing with. So Tana Bashir is saying that you have to have left out 2 or more things in order that the principle applies. Because if there's only one thing left out, you mention it. Because it's not a big schlep to write in one extra thing. So we're saying, what things did we leave out? We left out the fact that a kofar payment, meaning if you're muad ox, Kevin,
Yeah.
please. If you're, I'm addressing your question. So, if you're, so one of the things that Sangat might have left out is the kofar was left out. Why? Because we learned with the muad that the kofar payments you pay if your ox was warned, muad, and it killed another Jew. Because you're responsible in Shemaim for that. I mean, you were warned. This is a very serious offense. And what we're saying is that it wasn't left out here, because we're trying to see the 1 or 2 things that were left out. So we're saying the first thing that it left out is the subclause that the tam is a penalty or compensation, but there's no subclause mentioned. In other words, primary clause, it mentions muad is compensation. Subclause should be tam is either a penalty or compensation. So we're saying, if we're saying it's a penalty, then we're saying we left that out. And what other thing did we leave out because of the Tana Bashir concept of leaving 2 more things out? We said it was left out the kofar payment with regard, with regards to this shir, because we said we don't know what happens here, because there's a kofar paid with muad, but not with tam. And we're saying, no, it wasn't left out, because according to this particular Mishnah, the author was Rav Yossi Haglili, who states that you do pay half kofar for tam. So we're saying it wasn't left out. There's still a payment due. So that's why we're mentioning it here, that there is a payment due. Because the Mishnah says, listen, for tam, there's 2 leniencies. This was the Mishnah. The first leniency is you pay half payment, right? The second leniency is you pay from the gufa of the animal. And it was saying, but we don't know from the with the subclause what happens with the kofar payment. And it was left out to state that you don't pay. And we say, no. The author of this Mishnah was Rav Yosef Haglili. Yossi Haglili, who says you do pay half for kofar, because if you fully warned and you pay for a full kofar, you should have still looked after your ox anyway. And the fact that it caused damage, if you have to pay half payment, whether you see it as compensation or penalty, because you're either trying to penalize the damager because to wake up. The same thing, you have to pay a half kofar payment because it killed a person. Now the person should wake up. So Rav Yosef Lili says you do pay half a kofar. The rabbis say you don't, because it's a tame animal and you're not responsible in Shemaim, and it's not your fault. Does that make sense? So he's saying this, the author of this Mishnah must be Rav Yossi Haglili, because it wasn't left out. There wasn't an issue left out. So it carries on and says, my bull killed this other Jewish person. Umar Bill killed this Jewish person's ox. So it's saying in this particular case, I just want to read it for you. We've got a few minutes, and then I'm going to just share the screen. Just hang on, guys. I'm going to share a screen. Okay. So it says, come here an additional proof for the Mishnah. One who said, my ox killed so-and-so, referring to another Yid, or my ox killed an ox belonging to so-and-so. This owner pays based on his own admission. So if we say this owner pays on his own admission, what does this mean? It means it's compensation. It's not a penalty, because we know that an owner doesn't pay on his own admission. So we're saying, what is this not referring to an innocuous ox? What do you mean by an innocuous ox? It means an ox that doesn't, if it's innocuous, it's not dangerous. It means we're referring to a tum ox. So it's asking for which he pays half damage, proving that it's payment of money and not of fine. So we say, isn't this a proof that a tum damage is compensation? And we're saying, no, the Gemara rejects this proof. This is in Ketubot 41b. The ton is referring to a forewarned animal. So we're saying, when we say my ox killed this Jew, or my ox killed an ox belonging to this Jew, the owner pays on his own admission, meaning it's compensation. So we're saying, great, we seem to have clarity that half payment would be compensation. And it's saying, no, this tana is referring to a forewarned animal, meaning it's a muad ox. So we still don't know what's going on with the tam, the half payment damages. So then the Gemara asks, however, in the case of innocuous ox, which means tam, it doesn't have a history of damage, what is the halacha? Exactly what Kevin's saying. If he does not pay based on his own admission, then rather than teaching the latter clause of the Mishnah, so we're saying if he doesn't pay on his own admission, we know it's a compensation. Then rather than teaching that, why doesn't it just teach a different rule? One whose ox killed a slave belonging to so-and-so does not pay based on his own admission, and let him distinguish and teach the distinction within the case itself. So what it's saying is, listen, if we want to learn about a penalty, why didn't this particular Brisa turn around and say, my ox killed somebody's Evet Knani, their Canaanite slave? Because then we know it's the one example in a case where it's a penalty. Again, it's a fixed amount. You don't pay by your own admission, and the penalty is worth more. The 30 shekels of silver could be worth more than an Evet Knani, which could be worth only 1 dinar, for example. So we're saying, no, even in the case of where you pay for an Evet Knani, a Canaanite slave, it's with regard to a forewarned ox. However, the owner of an innocuous ox, a tame ox, does not pay based on his own admission. Meaning that it seems that for a tam, you do not pay on your own admission. So it rejects the proof. It's saying that if you do not pay on your own admission, it's clearly saying that it is a compensation. That's what it seems to say. So the Gemara rejects this proof because it's saying, fine, if we're saying that this is regard to a forewarned ox and the penalty is for a forewarned ox, then we're saying we still don't know what the law is regarding tam. And the Gemara basically says this entire Mishnah, even if you bring the example of the Evet Knani with regards to a penalty, because you don't pay by their own admission, is still speaking about a muad case. So now we don't know what the case is with a tam, an innocuous ox. We don't know if it's compensation or penalty, because both these Mishnahs are talking about a muad case. In other words, your ox killed, one person's ox killed a Jew. This person's ox killed another Jewish person's ox. Both of those cases, that's muad, a forewarned ox. And even the case with your ox killed a Canaanite slave belonging to a Jew, that's a case of a muad ox. So we're saying you can't come to any conclusion with regard to an innocuous ox, a tame ox. All we're saying here is that we don't know what the case is of an innocuous or tame ox, because both these Mishnahs and Brisas are teaching about a forewarned ox, a muad ox. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah,
That's what I'm trying to say. Is Kevin, we at this point where we're going backwards and forwards, and it's not as Michael thought maybe mental gymnastics. We're trying to find proofs because we need a case where we say, is it a penalty or is it compensation with tam? We know all now that muad, every case of muad is a case of compensation, and the only case of muad we can find with regards to a penalty is over and above the compensation with regard to a Canaanite slave, where you pay more than the slave is worth, a fixed amount you don't pay by your own admission. But it doesn't mean you don't pay for the damage. You just don't pay that added penalty. But the case of a Canaanite slave is a muad case as well. So every case we've learned according to now is muad. If your ox killed some other Jew's ox, if your ox killed another Jewish person with regard to the kofir, if your ox killed the Canaanite slave belonging to a Jew, all muad cases. Now we've got to say, what is the case in the tam? Is it like Rav Papa compensation? Is it like Rav Huna ben Yehoshua? And we've got to see. And then we're going to apply the case in halacha. That's what we're going to do. All right, guys, I hope you have a good day. Kevin, great question. Gavin, great question. Arthur, great reading. All right.
Thanks, man.
Day, guys.
Talk to you soon.
Cheers.
Ciao, bye.
Appreciate it.